On April 30th, 1945, Berlin was no longer the capital of a functioning empire. Soviet forces had fought their way into the city, surrounding the Reich Chancellery and closing in on the underground bunker where Adolf Hitler had spent the final weeks of his regime. The Nazi state was collapsing above ground, while below it, a small group of officials tried to understand what would happen next. Hitler did not leave Berlin. He died in the bunker that afternoon. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum identifies April 30th, 1945 as the date of his death, and post-war investigations established that he had died by suicide rather than escaping the city. But almost immediately, a second story began to emerge. It was a story of uncertainty, a story of missing remains, a story of conflicting Soviet statements, and eventually, a story that transformed one historical question into a persistent myth. Was Hitler really dead? And if he was, what exactly happened inside the bunker? The confusion began with the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the remains. Hitler's final days had unfolded amid chaos. Berlin was surrounded. Communications were breaking down. The German military situation was hopeless. Hitler had married Eva Braun shortly before his death, and the couple's final documents were prepared during those last hours. The National Archives preserves both their marriage documentation and Hitler's political testament. Then, on April 30th, Hitler and Braun died. Their bodies were subsequently taken outside the bunker and burned, according to the testimony collected by Allied investigators. That decision would have enormous consequences for historians, because there was no intact body available for the world to examine. Instead, investigators had fragments, and among the most important evidence were the teeth and jaw remains. This is where the story becomes less mysterious than popular culture often suggests. Hitler's dental condition was unusually distinctive. His dentist, Hugo Blasch, had treated him for years. American National Archives records contain Blasch's post-war interrogation and descriptions of Hitler's extensive dental work. The records were specifically examined for the purpose of identifying Hitler's remains. The Soviet investigators eventually obtained dental evidence. Dental personnel who had worked for Hitler were questioned. Their knowledge of his unusual dental reconstruction provided investigators with information that could be compared with the remains recovered in Berlin. This evidence became central to the identification. It was not a photograph. It was not a dramatic discovery of an intact corpse. It was forensic identification, and that distinction matters. Yet the Soviet Union did not immediately provide the world with a clear account. Instead, Soviet officials sometimes suggested that Hitler might still be alive. The uncertainty became fertile ground for rumors. By the summer of 1945, reports circulated that Hitler had escaped. Some stories placed him in Spain. Others claimed he had reached South America. Still others imagined secret routes out of Berlin. The rumors became so widespread that American and British intelligence agencies investigated reports of possible sightings. The U.S. National Archives documents this remarkable post-war search, showing how intelligence services followed numerous claims even though the accumulated evidence pointed toward Hitler's death in Berlin. The myth had begun to outlive the man. So where does the cyanide story fit? The historical record is more complicated than the simplified version often presented in documentaries and popular books. Accounts from the bunker and subsequent investigations have long associated Hitler's death with both a firearm and poison, while details concerning precisely how his death occurred have been debated. But the larger historical conclusion does not depend on resolving every detail of those final moments. Hitler died in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. That conclusion rests on multiple lines of evidence: eyewitness testimony, contemporary investigations, Hitler's dental records, recovered dental remains, and later forensic analysis. The evidence does not require a mysterious escape theory. The most important evidence came from the mouth rather than the bunker room. Hitler's dental work was highly distinctive. His dentist had kept detailed records. Dental assistants had knowledge of the unusual bridges and restorations. When investigators compared those descriptions with the recovered remains, the correspondence was compelling. The National Archives notes that Soviet investigators recovered a fragment of jaw and dental bridge material, and that Hitler's dental records were used in the identification process. Decades later, forensic researchers continued examining the surviving remains. A 2018 biomedical study concluded that the available dental evidence allowed a definitive identification of Hitler's remains. That is a crucial point. The historical case does not depend entirely upon witness memories from a chaotic underground bunker. It can also be tested against physical evidence. And this changes how we should understand the so-called bunker myth. The mystery was never simply, did Hitler die? The more interesting historical question is, why did the world spend so long wondering whether he had? Part of the answer lies in the destruction surrounding his final days. Berlin was a battlefield. The bunker was damaged. The bodies were deliberately burned. The Soviet advance created confusion. Information was controlled, and the Soviet government initially handled the discovery with considerable secrecy. In June 1945, Soviet officials were simultaneously allowing information about dental identification to circulate while also making statements that encouraged uncertainty. The resulting contradictions helped create an atmosphere in which rumors could flourish. British intelligence approached the problem differently. Historian Hugh Trevor-Roper was tasked with investigating what had happened. His investigation relied heavily on interviews with people who had been inside the bunker. By November 1945, his conclusion was that Hitler and Braun had died in the bunker on April 30th. The National Archives records his finding as the result of evidence gathered from eyewitnesses and British intelligence investigations. This was significant because it demonstrated that the case could be reconstructed without relying on Soviet statements alone. The witnesses described the final sequence. The documents established Hitler's intentions. The dental evidence provided physical identification, and the surrounding military situation explained why there was almost no realistic opportunity for a secret escape. There's another reason the cyanide story has remained so powerful. It sounds like the final piece of a mystery, a single substance, a hidden capsule, a dramatic final act. But history is rarely that neat. The surviving evidence does not give historians a perfectly filmed sequence of the final minutes. There is no complete eyewitness account of every second. Instead, historians reconstruct the event from different sources that overlap in important places. That is how historical investigation works. One source establishes the date. Another establishes the location. Another describes what witnesses saw. Dental evidence establishes identity. Documents establish Hitler's final decisions. And later forensic research tests the surviving physical evidence. Together, those pieces form a much stronger picture than any individual story. By April 30th, 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe was already beyond doubt. The Red Army was fighting through Berlin. The Nazi regime was collapsing. Germany's military position was irretrievable. Within days, Berlin would surrender. Within a week, Germany would surrender unconditionally in Europe. Hitler's death, therefore, did not create Germany's defeat. It was a consequence of it. The bunker was not the command center of a regime preparing for victory. It was the underground refuge of a dictatorship in its final hours. Above it, Soviet forces were taking Berlin. Around it, the Nazi state was disintegrating. And beyond it, the war was approaching its final conclusion. The cyanide myth, therefore, needs to be separated from two different questions. The first is what caused Hitler's death. The second is whether Hitler died at all. The second question has a much firmer answer. He died in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum records this as established historical fact. The surviving dental evidence has since been subjected to modern forensic examination, and the 2018 biomedical study described the remains as permitting definitive identification. The escape stories do not survive that evidence. What remains genuinely interesting is the uncertainty surrounding the final scene. History cannot reconstruct every detail with absolute certainty. Some testimonies conflict. Some evidence was destroyed. Some Soviet records remained inaccessible for decades. And early post-war investigators were working in a landscape of misinformation, political tension, and deliberate secrecy. That uncertainty is real. But uncertainty about individual details is not the same thing as uncertainty about the historical conclusion. The evidence overwhelmingly places Hitler's death in the Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. And perhaps that is the real lesson of the bunker myth. The most persistent historical mysteries are not always mysteries because the evidence is absent. Sometimes they survive because the evidence was complicated, because governments concealed information, because witnesses disagreed, because physical remains were damaged, and because a defeated regime left behind a story that people desperately wanted to believe might have ended differently. But when the rumors are stripped away, the historical record becomes remarkably clear. The dictator who had begun the war in Europe died as Soviet forces closed around Berlin. His regime was collapsing. His empire was finished. And the evidence left behind, documents, witnesses, dental records, and physical remains, allows historians to reconstruct what happened with a high degree of confidence. The bunker did not conceal an escape. It concealed the final chapter of Nazi Germany. And on 30 April 1945, that chapter ended.